he made the observation that we've taught people how to be great surgeons, but we haven't taught them how to live their lives as surgeons. And so I know some of you who are close friends think that I've only seen one movie in my life, and it's The Matrix. But I wanted to invite you to think for a second about what Morpheus is offering us here as we think about the content of what we're going to talk about tonight. You remember this idea about the red pill and the blue pill was a choice, a break in the road. If you take the blue pill, you go back to your life and act like this never happened. And if you take the red pill, you join the resistance and participate in improving things. So I'm going to invite you again to think about how you want to approach things after this evening is over with, red pill or blue pill. So each of us comes from very different backgrounds. It's been fun to talk to a number of you over the years and see how different your experiences are. But one thing that's the same for all of us is we all came to work today to relieve pain and suffering in the children that we work with. And as you can tell, we work in quite a challenging profession. We at times can be faced with things that cause significant distress in our personal lives, in addition to the challenges we face living within our own families. And we all have stories that we'd like to forget. I've listed a few of them here that are that people in our institution have had experiences with, and when we do hard things, we're going to accept risks. It has always amazed me that we would come to work to help pain and suffering in children, but we would walk past a colleague who was struggling. And while that's bothered me, I also recognize that we're reasonable people and we're doing it for a reason. There must be something in our culture that says it's okay. So with that in mind, I wanted to remind you once again that we're getting exactly the results that we should expect with a system that we're in, and if we want to change this, it's up to us to do some things differently. So we're now about 21 years out from To Err is Human, where we began to talk openly about error in medicine and the mortality rate that came with it. Skip Campbell with Dr. Greenfield wrote an article where they measured some of Maslach burnout's metrics, which are listed here. And the important part about this is that they identified that when we became more emotionally exhausted or more depersonalized, that the care we provided was worse. So this idea about self-care, helping one another, dealing with burnout, and helping to recover from adverse events is not just important for the individual, it's important for the institution as well. Now, each of us has had some challenges as we have figured out how to address the electronic medical record. Many of us work in hospitals that are corporate, that have been corporatized, and so as we move from the traditional private practice model from 50 years ago to the contemporary model, we often lose a lot of autonomy in the work that we do. We can struggle with our schedules. In our institution, the IT people call it pajama time. It's when you go home and you start working on those medical records that you didn't finish during the day instead of spending time with your spouse or your kids. If that wasn't an interesting environment alone, then we can throw this into a pandemic situation where we recognize that everybody's afraid and they're starting to work in isolation more, and then as we begin to accept standards of safety, not everybody observes those standards, and that causes distress as well, which makes our workplace less safe and makes our anxiety a little bit greater as we work here. Some of you have noticed during this time of isolation that the things in our professional life that distress us the most have increased during this time. And while APSA is a community that embraces and recognizes the importance of diversity, that isn't uniformly true in all aspects of our society, which can cause us to have a lot of distress as we look at the conflict and the violence and the racism that is so widely seen at this time. Our personalities, the things that brought us here and made us successful, are very adaptive in some ways. People celebrate our commitment, and yet there are times when we don't adapt very well, that we have trouble stopping, recognizing when we've done enough, and setting limits so that our families and we are not damaged by our activities. As Dr. Campbell let us know before, this cost of increasing emotional exhaustion and increasing depersonalization can cause us to have a higher likelihood of making mistakes and harming a patient, which in itself is a devastating thing and maybe the ultimate aspect of burnout, as I'll come back to in a minute. So I wanted to invite you to think with me for a second about an event from 12 years ago, or where the Olympics were in Beijing. And each of us will remember different things about the Olympics. Many of us remember Michael Phelps began his gold rush during that time. There were other important things that occurred. One of the things that captured my attention was the 4x100 relay race. The Americans had always won this race, and that's both American men and women. And these champions dropped the baton, both the men and the women, within about an hour of each other, and were disqualified. And so if you're a fan of American Olympics, then you could say, well, there goes 2 gold medals, but we could probably pause for a second and ask ourselves the question, what does this have to do with us? So all of these individuals were world class in what they did. They had been tested again and again and been champions, and they had done this procedure, this handoff, a zillion times, and they practiced it a zillion times, and yet they were on the big stage, a mistake was made, and they were disqualified. You and I have excellent training. We've gone through selection processes and demonstrated personal leadership in a variety of ways, and yet there are days for some of us when we make a mistake and are unable to recover. And so we're not amateurs. We're very good at what we do, and yet on occasion we still fail. About the time that the IOM and Dr. Campbell wrote their articles, Albert Wu wrote this article called, which gave a name to this event, called The Second Victim. And he talked about the anti-socialization of an individual in the MGH system who made a mistake. And he went on to describe this as, in much of the same way that Jenny did just a minute ago, where he said that, people feel personally responsible for this, and they feel like they failed the patient, and then they begin to second guess their skills, their knowledge base, and their competence, which for people who work in critical care surgery can be a devastating a hurdle to overcome. This is not only for the weak. This happens to all of us. And the awkward thing is that in most cases, people get no help from the healthcare organization that they're working from. In my personal experience years ago, I found that when the event had occurred, I knew I was in trouble. I was in a black place in my life. I went to the hospital and got no help. I went to the university and got no help. And so I had to go into the private community to find a stabilizing influence and help me recover. And in full disclosure, when 6 months later, when I kind of emerged from this fall, I was really angry. And it helped me working on this problem in the APSA community and with the AAP. It's helped me to recover from that, but also to recognize there are other people besides myself who struggled with this. So Susan Scott is a healthcare leader in the University of Missouri system, chief safety officer, and she has written some excellent articles about the process of being a second victim and how one goes through this experience. For those of you who can only read articles by surgeons, Carol Ann Moulton is a patobiliary surgeon at the University of Toronto, and she interviews 40 senior surgeons who have had an adverse event. This isn't high drama, but it's very close, and I would encourage you to consider reading this as you plan your activities and try to decide what the right thing to do is in your own institution. Dr. Scott went through this, these phases of what a patient or a physician experiences. When the event occurs, it is a chaotic event. It is very physiologic. You're tachycardic, sweaty, and sometimes you don't always think very clearly. And it is super helpful to have a partner or a colleague come help you during this time to normalize things and help you think clearly. After you go home that evening, the intrusive reflections that occur can be very, very persistent. It's hard to talk about this sometimes with people, and I can tell you from personal experience, when you close your eyes that night, the video starts to play and it just won't stop. And so it brings on feelings of inadequacy. When you return to work the next day, people will be cautious because they don't want to hurt you, and yet this cautiousness makes you feel isolated and talked about, and it really is very threatening. Because we're in a highly regulated industry, when an event occurs like this, there's a mandatory series of interviews that has to occur. The problem is they just keep coming and coming and coming, where it's peer review or patient safety or M&M or council of chairs or a visit with an attorney or risk management. These just keep going and going and going, and as they do, the scab keeps getting pulled off, and it makes the healing difficult to obtain. As I mentioned, some people need to seek emotional first aid, and when that occurs, it can be super helpful in helping them normalize their feelings, get back in the saddle, and start to be safe again. The outcomes here that we're thinking about are boiled down into kind of three basic ones. The first one is that people leave or they drop out, they change professions. Each of us has a group of people that we work with in the operating room that we always want with us when something bad is happening. And you know, here we kind of refer to them as SEAL Team 6. We lost a couple of anesthesiologists who were part of our SEAL Team 6 a few years ago because as a system we didn't handle a bad day in the operating room well with them, and they ended up leaving because they felt unsupported and demonized because of this. Some people survive. You can see them in your professional life. You can pick them out a mile away. They're coping. The joy in their work is gone, and there seems to be a pall or a persistent sadness that just keeps going on. What we really want are people who will learn from this and will thrive. Nobody wants to have this experience, but since it's part of our professional lives, we might as well figure out ways to learn from it, to mature from it, and to try and figure out how to become advocates for patients and for safe surgical care. And that's, I think, ultimately the goal that we're after here. Most of us live in a culture where these conversations are allowed to occur, or these actions are allowed to occur. Oftentimes we feel that we are not good doctors when this happens, and as opposed to recognizing, as Gail mentioned a few minutes ago, that our number came up, that this is going to happen to all of us. It's part of the human condition. I personally felt a sense of intense, like a sense of imposterhood when this occurred. I had just been elected to the AAP leadership a month earlier, and when I showed up to that meeting, it was about 3 weeks after this adverse event, and I just didn't feel worthy to be there. There were people who were being kind to me and being nice to me, and I just felt I don't belong here. When this occurs, oftentimes people see their lives through this very small keyhole. They feel that this error or this death will define them, and they can't get away from the voice on their left shoulder telling them that they're worthless and that they don't belong here. In contrast, we could be peer supporters who help people understand that this making mistakes is part of the human condition, that the terrible feelings we have are normal and appropriate and represent the feelings of a competent, excellent, caring physician, and that we can provide support and solidarity during an event like this. I think most importantly, a peer supporter can pull an individual away from the keyhole and help them understand, remember all the good patients they've cared for well, that they are not this mistake, they are not defined by this, and this is not going to change their career for the worse. So in a different time and place, if I had more than 20 minutes, I would go into these things in detail, but I thought I'd just touch base for a minute on these 4 items. The first one is, when I started this journey several years ago, there really wasn't that much written about this, but there's a lot more now. And if you were to search resiliency or burnout in PubMed, you would see that it has become a crescendo in publications. Tate Shanafelt, most of you know, was a hemonc doc in the Mayo system and recently moved to Stanford to be the chief wellness officer. He wrote a great article with people from the American College of Surgeons from a survey that they did. Southwick and Charney are psychiatrists who work with abuse survivors and Army Rangers and study their positive and negative approaches toward resiliency. The interesting thing is both this book and this article have these same 10 aspects of personal resilience. And while I can't go into these in detail tonight with the time constraints, I would invite you to look at that article in that book and explore these as you feel appropriate. It is very interesting for those of you who are less likely to be physically active. It's disappointing to know that physical wellness and fitness is a foundation of resilience, and so you might want to explore some aspects of how you could address that. So we live in a culture that really focuses, especially over the last 20 years, on patient safety. We each have some vernacular in our hospital that helps us remember that we have gone this many days without injuring a patient. And each time we do a surgical timeout for a procedure or an operation, we recognize that we're going through these things, as painful as they may be, so that we do the right operation on the right patient at the right time with the right medications and the right approach. And this has helped us change things. Those of you whose institutions are involved in Solution for Patient Safety recognize that there are communication skills that we've been teaching each other for several years. They help us to communicate in a manner that we don't drop the ball and harm a patient. Gale's institution has this chart on their website. It's a little dated, but it shows you that when they engaged in the SPS activities and began to have these high reliability conversations, they captured more events initially, but then their serious safety events dramatically went down. My hospital is run by attorneys, and they won't let us put this on our website. So this is my bootleg attempt to let you know that when we started this journey several years ago and began the conversations, the high reliability conversations that are serious safety events went down to 0 in 2016 and 17. Now, we don't live in the Garden of Eden, and we've bounced back up again, but this is the proof of concept. If we do this, it can help us save and protect patients. So our purpose tonight is to talk a little bit about peer support. If you were to get sick, somebody would visit you, might bring a casserole, they'd ask you about stuff. When and yet in healthcare, we allow people to isolate. We don't do the moral equivalent of bringing them a casserole and talking with them about things that will build them up. Oftentimes, we see people in this fashion. They might need some time to process things, and we leave them alone when in reality they're desperate to have some human contact, to be told that they are meaningful and competent people and that they're important to us. in my own personal journey, one of my partners, after a week or so of watching me in my isolation, came into my office and closed the door and just spent 10 or 15 minutes just affirming me, telling me how important I was to our group and what a good surgeon I was and how highly he thought of me. And that was just a real drink of cool water in a difficult time for me. Because of our activities here, we have put in place a program. At Gail's institution has a very similar one. This just lets you know how ours is organized. We have awareness training. We have peer supporters that are clinicians in each division that both look for adverse events and people who need help, but also are available to talk and to help with people when they're in trouble. And when people need to be referred to outside resources, then we are available to do that. What we really want to do here is help people to become, once again, in their mind, a trusted member of the team. So there's a lot of things that we can do as leaders. There are a lot of great articles. Joe Shapiro has written some, which I sent to those of you who are registered. There are books written about this that are pretty good quality. Joe has a number of videos that are on YouTube that you can look up, which are very well done, that give great examples. Remember that pediatrics resident from MGH, Albert Wu? Well, he went on to be rich and famous professor of medicine pediatrics at Hopkins and put in place a program there called Resilience in Stressful Events. And he and his colleagues have trained people over the years to learn how to address this and to support their colleagues. So I'm going to wrap this up by just summarizing these are some of the things that we discussed. And there are lots of opportunities for us to make this better. And so I'm going to turn open this up for a few questions if someone wants to ask some questions, and just invite you once again to think about this red pill or blue pill. Thanks. Lauren, can we unmute people? Or there, I have to stop sharing the screen, sorry. Okay, there we go. Anybody have any questions before we move on?
Sure. Thank you, Kurt. There's a couple questions that have popped up in the chat that I maybe can read as people are getting their thoughts together, and feel free to use the chat. Obviously, some of you have already been doing already. Somebody asked, in Gail and Kurt, both in your hospitals, as you've lowered adverse events, have you decreased burnout?
Great question. We have not measured burnout in that way. We've measured more aspects of patient safety, and we look for ways in which the death by 1,000 cuts that some of us experience in our daily activities, interacting with the hospital staff sometimes, and how that influences our patient safety activities. But the actual burnout issues we have not addressed. We've only addressed the prevention and recovery, as well as the safety events. Gail, how about you? Have you approached this differently?
No, I would concur with that. I don't know that we've lost any partners to burnout per se. And while it's true that our adverse events have gone down, it's so hard to pinpoint, why that is, because there are so many aspects that contribute to that. And as you know, we had Rich Briley as our chief medical officer. So when he came to Nationwide like 12 years ago, his whole goal was to decrease adverse events. And a lot of effort was, put into that in terms of quality improvement efforts. So while I would like to think it's because we, really strengthened something like, second victim syndrome support, it's a very complicated issue.
So Lauren, you're going to come back to that in a minute, aren't you, in your presentation about the kind of the business case for this? That might be just a different take on that question.
Yep, I will address that in a little while. There are a couple other questions I'll just read aloud. So we usually associate these with patient issues, but I think career failures should also be addressed. So the rejected grant, the missed promotion. Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting question. Like when is there a need for peer support? And I don't think it necessarily has to be. I think the concept that we're focusing on tonight is certainly more around adverse patient events, but it's not just for that. I totally agree. Career failures can be a need for peer support. Similarly, with all the stress related to COVID-19, we kind of beefed up our local efforts to provide more peer support just for people coping with the pandemic and stress related to that.
So, Lauren, one of the things that Susan Scott taught us when she came to Atlanta a couple years ago was that we often think of this in terms of a medical error event, but there are people who leave everything on the field and still lose a patient, and they can feel equally a sense of loss in that way. But perhaps more commonly what happens is that our individual families experience things. A couple years ago, I have a brother-in-law who suicided, and that left a big impact on our family. We had an anesthesiologist in our hospital whose sister suicided. We've had colleagues whose spouses have died, or whose kids have cancer, or who have lost a child. And all of those things, while they aren't adverse events, the moral distress and the distraction and the suffering that they have, which sometimes occurs in silence, can devastate people. I would say that is a variation on career failure, in the sense that family failure can be a big problem as well. So this might. Do you have other
Can I add
questions?
one more thing?
Yeah.
One more thing about Nationwide. Nationwide Children's, I think, was spending so much money on external outside counseling for physicians and faculty and staff that we decided a couple of hire our own psychologist. And so we have a psychologist that is just available to all of the faculty and staff at Nationwide Children's. And I've availed myself and our faculty of his services on several occasions, and I've found it to be very useful. So that would just be another avenue. If somebody was really struggling because of, an adverse event in the operating room, I would be able to refer them to this person. Or if something happened to our group that affected the whole group in a negative or challenging way, he would meet with us as a group on as many occasions as is needed. And I've found that to be helpful as well.
So Gail, it would be maybe in another time and place, it'd be interesting to hear from you what scenario you could create that might influence the entire group. I remember when I came to Nationwide to get the training from your program several years ago, that there had been a staff member who had died, and that had left a big impression on a lot of people. And so maybe as you think about it, you can share with us, either written or otherwise, what other scenarios might occur that would not influence just the individual but the group. I really hadn't thought about that much. Thanks for bringing that up. Mm-hmm. This might be an appropriate time, Lauren, to transition to the video, unless we have other questions that are burning.
I think we can move on. I mean, I think all of you guys can read the chat. There's a lot of comments, and I appreciate the participation. I just wanted to mention, someone had asked about sort of where do you start if your hospital is doing nothing, and also how do you make resources available to trainees, and those are both things that I'm going to touch on in a little while when we talk about program building. So just hold that thought. But yeah, let's just keep the chat going, and we will.
Lauren, can I introduce this video real quick?
Yeah.
So when you registered for this, I sent you a couple of articles, but I also sent you the narrative of a potential peer support. You can call it intervention if you want to, but a conversation between two colleagues. So as we were planning this event tonight, we discussed or debated a little bit about how we would address this, and we thought we'd want you to see what this might look like. And So Matt Clifton and I are going to role play the peer support intervention. Now, I know some of you will think this will deserve an Oscar because the acting is so exceptional, but it's really pretty bad. But we had 4 tragedies here last year in our hospital, and these skills were really important to help us to normalize and the lives of the individuals who are involved. And so I'm really glad I know how to do high-end laparoscopy, but I'm also glad I know how to provide peer support to a struggling colleague. So with that in mind, you can vote for me for an Oscar after this thing. But in the meantime, Lauren, why don't you go ahead and play this? It's going to take a little more than 12 minutes. And as you listen to this, I would invite you to think. I'm just going to ask the question: what do you learn, and what did you notice, and then what did you feel as you were listening to this? Lauren, go ahead.
I heard you had a rough day in the OR the other day, and you and I have worked together for a while, but I'm not sure that you knew that we had a peer support program in our hospital, so that when the inevitable rough day in the operating room or in the ICU occurs, that we can have colleagues who understand and care for one another come and help. And so I was just curious if, since we're all going to experience this, if you would be interested in talking to a little bit about the peer support approach and perhaps letting us help you get back to normal more quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've heard some whisperings about the program, but have never personally been involved in it, so I don't know too much about it. But I know that it exists. I was sort of under the impression that it was for people who were really on the brink of a breakdown, and so didn't know if this was something that applied to me or not.
I really appreciate your saying that. I think that everyone that you work with on the medical staff, either now or in the past or in the future, is going to have this experience. It's not for broken people. It's for all of us. I was just going to ask you, can you give me one sentence about what happened? I don't need to know the details, but I just wanted to know where you're coming from and what happened briefly.
Sure. Well, I was set up to do a pretty routine appendectomy. Happened to be on a pediatrician's child, and when I put my initial trocar in, found my way into the aorta. And we controlled it, and the child survived, but it was a pretty rattling event.
Wow, so that's that must have been very challenging to have that conversation with the family. What are the dominant challenges you're facing right now? What's on your mind? What are you worried about?
Well, certainly worry about the child, although he's recovered and is home already. He looks fine. But I worry about implications for me personally getting back on the horse. You know, next time I go to do an appendectomy, I'm concerned about whether or not I'll second guess myself and potentially cause another error, or if folks around the operating room are going to be talking about this. I worry a little bit about other pediatricians in the community being afraid to send their patients to me because of what's happened.
While each of us respond to this differently, I want you to know that both I and some of your other older partners have had experiences just like this. We've walked this path and empathize with you a lot. this can be really traumatic, and it can keep you up at night and so forth. One of the things that I think it's super important for you to know from our perspective is that the fact that you feel bad about this means you're a good doctor. And on the far side of this, as you look back, the things I'm about to say will be self-evident to you. But right now I can see it's a little bit unknown. I want to reassure you that as a peer supporter, my job is to pull you away from this keyhole that makes you think that your rest of your career is going to be defined by this one event. It will not. You are not this mistake. It will not define you. And so I'm really right now, while it's fresh, it's pretty hard. But just like you counsel your patients about how wounds will feel a little bit better every day. Right now, while this is right up in front in your proximate memory, it's so hard to step away from it, and it can be something that we perseverate about. And yet, as time goes on, this is going to get better. And we are, with your permission, we won't leave you alone. We'll help you walk through this. While we each mourn a little differently when something like this happens, there are some similarities that occur. When you have dealt with adverse events in the past, what did you do to help gain perspective again? You didn't get into this responsible position by parachuting there. You're a durable, road-tested individual. How did you cope in the past? What did you do that was successful?
Yeah, I mean, I've fallen back on some of the things like, spending quality time with my family, people that I know value me for, a person that I am, irrespective of the work that I do. Try to blow off steam or, that sort of thing with exercise. And so I've been trying to get back on the horse with that, but it's been challenging. I keep replaying the events over and over in my mind, and I feel like it's really distracting because it'll happen at various times during the day. It might be when I'm in the operating room. It might be when I go to try to work out. I'm just all of a sudden running the same loop back through my head over and over.
Boy, I understand that. It's especially disconcerting at the end of the day when you're tired and you want to sleep really badly. You close your eyes and the video starts playing. I know you have a Peloton, you bike a lot. Has that been helpful in getting you to regain perspective at all?
Yeah, I mean, having an outlet for the energy is certainly helpful, and sort of just have some other outlet for my stress, I think has been useful. So I think I probably need more of that, but I think that's a step in the right direction.
You're not able to give yourself that time right now? I guess what I'm asking is, number one, some of us feel like we're not doing the right thing when we take care of ourselves. And so do you need permission to take care of yourself right now?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I sort of feel like, gosh, I've had this terrible thing happen, and, should I be doing something if I have downtime to try to help prevent that from happening again instead of going and working out for an hour? Is there something that I should be doing to sharpen my own skills to prevent myself from having another error?
Some of these errors are going to occur on a predictable rate, and when you and I and the rest of the group meet at M&M and we do our collegial interventions with each other, we're trying to create a system that helps us provide that care. When you were younger and you were trying to pass exams and so forth, you disciplined yourself to read and to study and to learn these things. It may be time now to discipline yourself, to care for yourself so that you can return to 100% more quickly. And if necessary, we can help you do that. Have you ever, I know this sounds, you're going to think I'm being a little frou-frou here, but have you ever had worked on mindfulness activities that help you to, to think about one thing so you can go to sleep, or help you to think about something else so you can get the video to stop playing? You're a disciplined guy. You got here in that fashion. Are there things that you've used in the past to discipline yourself to move into a positive study mode or a positive work mode, and can those things be helpful for you now?
Yeah, I've used that before, but I never really considered using it in this context, and so that's something I'd be willing to try.
The empathy that all of us have for you is very great, because we're all having similar experiences. You look at our division last year, we had 4 tragedies last year, and in each time we had people sit down with the individuals and help them move through this, and you're important to us. We want you to move through that as well. And the anxiety about the unknown, about whether this is going to change your career, it's going to change your career for the better, because as you learn from this, as you've overcome things in the past, you're going to be much, much better and a real advocate for your patients. Are you confident in what you're doing, or would taking a few days off or a week off be helpful for you? Or is that going to make it harder to get back in the saddle? You know yourself best. I'm just asking, what would be best for you?
I think at this point, for me, taking time away would just give me more time to perseverate. I think for me, it's better to try to get back into the normal routine of things and just try to move forward, being thoughtful about every step that I take. But I think time away is potentially going to be detrimental.
I had a tragedy several years ago. I knew if I stepped away, it was going to be really hard to come back. I'm doing this as your friend and your partner, as part of just what we do for each other here. Do you feel like talking to a professional would be valuable for you? And I mean, these are, first of all, my conversation with you is confidential. We're not going to talk about this other places. But secondly, would it be helpful to talk to a professional, a psychiatrist, psychologist about this? Would you value that? And if so, I would be happy to help facilitate that for you.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, great. With your permission, I will have the psychologist contact you, but is it okay if I check back with you in a few days?
That'd be really nice.
Okay, great. When we celebrated matching in pediatric surgery, we were thinking about all the cool things we would do. We didn't really think that we were going to have days like this, and yet they were always there. And so it's just a matter of us learning how to change the culture of letting people suffer alone, to kind of sharing that burden with all of us, and helping, again, step away from that keyhole. All you can see is this event, and we perseverate about it, and helping you remind yourself and remember of all the good patients and all the patients you provided excellent care for, and that this is not going to define your career. It's when we recover from this as a group with you, we're all going to be better because of it. Thanks for visiting with me. I'm sorry that you had this experience, but we're going to help you get through it together. Okay?
Thanks very much.
So I can't tell if it was more painful to think about the adverse event than it was to watch me act that out. But does anyone, what did you guys notice aside from the exceptional acting? What did you notice? What did you learn?
I just want to speak up and say I do think you deserve an Oscar. I thought it was absolutely great role playing and very, very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think what I noted was it was really nice that there was prompting to kind of lead the conversation forward, because I think in many of our practices we do have some of these informal conversations when something doesn't go as planned, but to kind of have next steps that take you through the entire process.
Yeah, this is Terry. I completely agree with that. Having the education and have the script is very helpful. I think there's a tendency that I've observed that a natural response is to start telling your own story, and you're reliving your own story. Or like, you know, if you say, oh, I got a divorce, and someone else tells you their 3-hour story of theirs too. And so that completely eliminated it with the script, and it kept the focus, you know, saying we've been there, but it kept the focus on the person. And I think that is a real benefit of the training. And I think that really stands out to me.
It's interesting you bring that up, Terry. We didn't practice this beforehand, as you could tell. If I had the opportunity to do this, I would have probably written this down a little bit more, because it was going to be for public consumption, and try to get Matt to talk more rather than, because I did most of the talking, unfortunately. I've been with Matt before where he sat with a colleague who had had a bad day, and Matt was really spectacular about this. The colleague really didn't want to talk much, and Matt kind of put him in a position where he said, you know, I got all day. I'm just going to wait here until we discuss this, because it's important to both of us. And that may seem a little heavy-handed, but it was, I think, just with what the individual needed. So anyway. Other thoughts? Thank you, Terry, by the way.
Sure.
Kurt, where do you feel the role of looking at the underlying factors that may have caused the error? Is that the role of the group, or is that the role of the psychologist?
Well, thanks for asking that, Trey. So I'm going to reframe what you just said in a little different way. When I contact someone, or when someone contacts an individual as a peer supporter, it's really important that they understand that you're there to help them, because they may stop listening as soon as they hear peer. They may hear peer and think peer review as opposed to peer supporter. And you know, peer review and root cause analysis will go through the systemic situations that cause the event. But when we introduce ourselves, we make a point about saying, we are not from patient safety. We are not from peer review. We are your colleagues and are here to help you, so that they recognize that both it's confidential and it's protected conversation, but this is here to benefit them and help them get better.
If I could just add one other phrase that I think is super helpful, which is, I'm here to walk with you through this, so that you're conveying, accompanying them on this journey as their advocate and friend, and not as anyone who's analyzing it.
And in regards to when I talk about the underlying events, I'm really talking about what's been going on in the individual's past professional or even personal relationships that led to a distraction, or, you know, whatever. Basically, you know, the emotional exhaustion or the depersonalization, what caused that ended up in the air? Who's addressing that? Is that being addressed by the colleagues, or is that being addressed by the psychologist, or both?
Great question, Trey. I don't know that I have a standard answer for that. I think that the psychologist would likely address that. If you knew that your partner was generating 10,000 RVUs each year and was, you know, never going home, then you might make some assumptions and ask them if they need to slow down just a little bit. But a great question. I'm going to say yo no say about that one. I don't know.
Kurt, can I offer one when help. I think one of the great things that you did was, you know, you're seen by your partner as a leader, and therefore that means something. By the same token, you need another partner that can get at what Trey's pointing out. There are, in a lot of these situations, extra factors that either a group of people or another single partner in this can help look into and be able to begin that investigation. That's totally separate from the safety reviews or any of the other M&Ms that are going on. And the only other thing that I'd like to ask you is, what would you have done if he had refused that extra help that you offered? Because this is a big situation, and you could tell it was a big hit. How would you manage that?
So, so that does happen because we all mourn differently. When people turn us down, then we usually say, that's great, you know, we all will address this differently. Can I check back with you in a week and see how things are going? And you know, sometimes people just don't want to talk because they're not ready to talk and they're afraid to be emotional, and a few days later it may change. So no one ever has become upset with me if I asked if I could follow up with them, and yet sometimes people just address this differently. They move on and aren't as affected by it as others are. So I hope I answered your question, Tom.
Very good.
Kurt, there are a couple other questions maybe you could address from the chat, sort of related to what you were just talking about refusing help. So what if there's someone who completely refuses all help? Someone you know has experienced an adverse event, is really suffering, but they're shutting out any attempt to help them. How do you handle that?
You know, I think that agency is a big deal. We have to honor their decisions. Having said that, if you or the partners recognize that they're in some ways becoming dangerous, then I think adverse event or not, then maybe we, as Tom said, we choose a different person in the medical community to approach them about problematic behaviors. Because this, you know, the purpose of our conversation tonight is to take a group of well-meaning surgeons who work in a difficult situation and learn first responder skills about how to support one another during hard times. And there are other venues and places where we can talk about how to do collegial interventions when people are having quality problems. I think that, as Tom pointed out, I think that's a different conversation than what we're having tonight. But if there are quality problems, we can express interest in the individual. One person or another person can invite them in to have a difficult conversation about behaviors that are causing problems in the operating room.
And then there's another question about how much do you have to practice in order to really feel comfortable with the process?
You guys must have. So I hadn't practiced that a lot. We've learned these skills over time. I mean, Dr. Shapiro gave us that script, which I think in some ways helped me modify what I'd done for the 5 or 6 years before that. And so let me just make one observation. Someone a few minutes ago made the point that it's really important not to start, Terry made the comment, not start talking, that you don't bring up divorce because someone's going to take 3 hours and talk to you about their divorce. Gail didn't mention this, and Jennifer didn't either, but when Jennifer and I talked about this a couple of years ago, she made the point that Gail normalized this situation by briefly letting her know that she had walked this path also, and that and she had made a bad mistake in the operating room. And you know, Gail's a highly thought of individual, and so if someone as competent as she can have a devastating day in the operating room, then maybe we can recover from this also. And Jennifer also made the comment that about a half hour later, Larry Moss walked into her office and closed the door and did the same thing. Basically said, here's a guy who's the CEO of a major system, and he had a bad day in the operating room, and he recovered from it, and he talked about it briefly, and then expressed his confidence in Jennifer. And I think they both did that, which was maybe the most important thing that they did, was reminding her how valued she was. So.
Kurt, it's Gail. I have a little bit of a funny story to tell you about a complication that I had many years ago when I was a young faculty member. So I had a complication in the operating room, and I'll never forget it. I called Dr. Donna Caniano, who was the chief at that time, and I described to her the entire complication. I was just devastated. I mean, I went through all the things that you're, describing about self-doubt, et cetera, et cetera. She sat down with me. She looked me straight in the eye, and she said, I just want to tell you that the exact same complication happened to Dr. Clatworthy when he was the chief. And that made me feel so much better, because I thought, wow, if Dr. Clatworthy could do that, then it wasn't as bad as I thought. And I'll never forget that. So that helped me a lot.
Thanks, Gail.
There's a couple of questions about, and then there's a couple of questions about kind of finding the right match when you are in a formal peer support program and you have a person in need of support. Someone made a comment about, with Matt, you're clearly in the same division and have a relationship as context. So how do you build that with other divisions or departments? Or do you need to take that into account when matching someone with a peer supporter? And there's also a question about how the power differential plays into the role of the peer supporter. Does it make sense to have the higher person on the hierarchy as the supporter?
So let me answer the second question first. And I'm going to reference Dr. Shapiro on this one. She came to our institution in January and spent a day with us on the hospitals tab. And she made a couple of observations which I think are important. When we first started this, we asked for volunteers, and there were a number of people who volunteered that were very, very young in their career, and that put them in an awkward situation, because sometimes the adverse events occurred in people who are my age, and it was hard for them to approach them in that vulnerable situation. And so Joe made the point that at Brigham and Women's that they picked the peer supporters in the system. This was something they invited people to do, and these people were, I don't know, for lack of a better term, they were senators in the system. They were people that everybody knew and everybody trusted and admired. They were good doctors, and people admired them. And so when they spoke to you and asked you if you would talk with them, and they did it in this gentle manner where they were obviously respecting you, then I think in some ways it was very validating for them. And also, I think when Gail told Jennifer that she had had some difficulties as well, and then that made the conversation safe for Jennifer, safer, because they were peers and it kind of made the power differential go away. So I think I just said two things. The first one was it may not be fair to a person in their first year of practice or second year of practice to be in a peer supporter role unless they're talking to somebody who went through the match with them or was a resident partner with them, because I think that's a very different scenario where you could, some of my fellows, as they've gone on to other jobs, I've said, who were the people that you stayed close to when you went through the match or went through your training? And they'd list a couple of individuals, and then in turn I would say, have you talked with them at all about some of the, having a bad day in the operating room? And they hadn't. In some cases they had, in other cases they didn't, but in that situation they were peers already, and they recognized that they could create their own support system that way. I'll be careful about how I say this, but Ron Herschel and I were have been very close for years, and in our first 10 years of practice, I think we talked a fair amount about challenges we were facing or mistakes we made. And I remember him calling me and talking about a particularly hard date he'd had, and I'm not sure I was very skilled. I was just his friend and so forth. And I in turn did the same for him when I had an ECMO disaster a few years later and so forth. And so some of these are organic. They're networks that we already have, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to massage them, I think, or nurture them, so that not only can we be friends that enjoy having a Coke together or having our families meet and stuff like that, but we can support each other when we have both career failures as well as adverse events. Lauren, I think Dr. Wesson was I think he may be asking for therapy after having worked with me in Toronto for a while. This may be his way of asking for help. So, David?
My brain's trying to remember if we had any similar experiences together. I think we remembered specific cases, Kurt, but first of all, I just wanted to thank you and Gail and Lauren for bringing this out. And these are very important issues, and I guess I'm at the end of my career now, and I can see how things might have been better for me if we'd had this kind of support. I have a practical question, though. Do you keep any kind of record of these conversations? I'm thinking particularly of the people who turn down support. And do you keep a note that I spoke with so and so on this date, and this is, and I know you're not supposed to record details of the events and that sort of thing, but do you have any record of these interventions?
So thanks for asking. So so referrals come to peer support from peer review, from patient safety, from quality, from the night supervisor and stuff like that, and sometimes from their partners and colleagues. When we have a conversation, there's usually one person who kind of runs the program, and she will ask us to reach out to an individual. And really what we're doing is we keep a record of the numbers, but not really of the details. Now, Gail's institution, they have a little bit more detail about this. They can tell you a little bit more about the issues that were involved, but they also protect the individual's identity and stuff like that. And so really it's what I think both programs are doing is they're trying to learn from the experience to see how the program should be changed. And frankly, that's why we sent the upfront material and the questions, because hopefully when we finish tonight, after Lauren's given us her thoughts about implementation of the program at the institutions, that the group will counsel together a little bit to figure out how this evolves and what the next steps are. Because when we talked about this with the Board of Governors 2 years ago, we had suggested that what we do is do a train the trainer event, and there were a couple people in the meeting who were very, very outspoken about how adversarial their institution was, and that it wasn't a safe place for them to raise their hand and ask for help. And so they were really advocates for APSA being an organization that would offer some form of service. And if that's the case, and it's not an organic network like Lauren and I were talking about before with the people you matched with or you went through residency with, then in some ways, when we do this, we have to figure out how to learn about it so that we can adjust it. And so I've never really talked to anybody about that when I was in the peer support moment, but I have reported back and said, I made the contact and we'll follow up with them next week. And I haven't really said much more than that. I think in some ways we've lost information that way because it would help us to
alert from calendar,
figure out how to
couples walk MTN Park.
Sorry, that would help us learn how to mature the program a little bit. So.
Kurt, just one comment to David about that. And if you think your institution can bomb us back to the dark ages, the states are now, depending upon certain laws that are circulating or certain case material that's circulating that's really, really challenging, anything that might be suspect as peer review. So any conversations, I would urge for the vast majority that they be, as you pointed out in your conversation, that they're confidential and that nothing will be recorded or leave the room. I think that's the best advice that any attorney or any chief medical officer would give is do what you're doing, and what you're doing is important, but recording is the least. Even though there is that learning phase that you want to do, that can be, I think, accomplished by the peer support teams getting together and discussing their own cases privately, and even not having minutes in those meetings. It's amazing what how adversarial the plaintiff's bar can be when you're just trying to do the right thing.
So thanks for sharing that, Tom. I'll just make a comment. I do not work in the Garden of Eden here, and people think that our peer supporter program is pretty nice, but we've had some bumps in the road. And last summer we had one where some attorneys approached a colleague and put some parameters on them about not talking about an event that occurred that really derailed them for a while. And so we kind of went back to the attorneys and said, you know, you've really cut the legs out of this program by doing that. And we had a very frank discussion about this, and this would be the only time, I think, that I've ever had a conversation with the hospital attorneys that I felt like had gone in a good direction. But the summary of the conversation was that when we started this program, that they felt that they had clearly stated that this was a protected conversation, and we were governed by peer review laws in our conversations. And so as an institution, we've made that very, very clear to people that these conversations are protected by Georgia state law, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we may lose that if everyone, you know, if a plaintiff's attorney attacks that, but our system approaches these conversations as if they're protected conversations. And the attorneys have been very clear about that. I appreciate your raising the flag on that, Tom. Thank you. Hey, Lauren, it's almost 20 after, and I want you to be able to talk and still have the conversation. So.
Sure. No, thank you guys all for participating, and it is really nice to see people's faces as Mary requested people turn on their videos. So thank you for doing that. I think one more thing I wanted to mention in response to what Tom was just talking about, I think one of the things that was hard for me to learn and adjust to as a supporter is, I think especially as surgeons, we tend to really want to go over the details of the event and like, well, what if I just, you know, opened the fascia a little bit more and seen where I was putting that trocar and avoided it, and you get into these nitty-gritty details. And I think when you're giving support, you want to try to steer the conversation away from that type of detail sharing, which is also helpful if it's potentially going to be discoverable, and more just, and you could see in Kurt's example, like they didn't go into the details of the case at all, and that's not really what you're supposed to be doing. And it's just talking about how you're feeling about the event and how it's normal to be feeling that way. And so, but without going into a lot of those details. So that's just sort of another reason to steer away from details. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears for a minute and share my screen, and I will make these slides available to everyone. I think Kurt already emailed his out, just about starting to build a program. So I wanted to also introduce Jennifer Pendley, who's on the call as well. She's the chief of psychology, and I work with her at Nemours in Wilmington, Delaware, and she has been a wonderful partner for me, sort of I wouldn't have thought to seek her out. So I invited her to join me in the presentation, just so everybody can understand a little bit more about how you can find allies in your institutions. So, and then the big disclaimer, we are very, very early in this process of establishing a program at Nemours. We've gotten really great support from our leaders, but we're still very early on. So I don't know everything about this, and it's great to have Kurt on the phone and also people like Gail who've had more experience. But I think I can share with you kind of a newcomer's perspective on this. So what I wanted to go over was strategies. First of all, just to increase awareness of the second victim syndrome and why there's a need for peer support, starting with what I call grassroots efforts and then transitioning to more formal program building. How to find partners and allies in your institutions and how to engage leaders, and then also to share some of the materials that we've developed. This is a QR code, and I'll have some links later in the presentation to some PowerPoint presentations and other stuff I'll tell you more about, so you don't just reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. So obviously all of you understand why this is important, or you wouldn't be here. When you think about just the sheer numbers of how common medical errors are that results in death, there's almost 500,000 per year, and there's about 600,000 doctors in this country, so it averages out to 1 per year per physician almost. And it's kind of staggering to think about it that way. And obviously, I think for us as surgeons who take care of children, I think we're particularly vulnerable. I think when we commit an error, it's often literally with our own hands, and that causes harm. I think it's just another level of difficulty in handling that and in recovering from that. And there's also research showing that when you deal with adverse events in children, you're at a much higher risk of experiencing second victim syndrome, and this is just what we do every day. So I think we are a particularly high-risk group. And I think when I think about wellness, I sort of thinking about this as stopping the bleeding. And I have a hard time focusing on any other aspect of wellness before this is addressed. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. Kurt inspired me to feel comfortable talking about this, and just to know that it was actually a thing people talked about when he gave his presidential address at the surgical section of the AAP a few years ago. And thank you to APSA for giving us this platform as well. I wanted to share some of our wellness survey results. You might have seen some of this as part of the national meeting presentation. We did have a session presenting these results, but I just wanted to summarize the results specifically regarding our experience with adverse events in our organization. So we asked a question about how often have you personally experienced a medical error resulting in patient harm or death, and almost 80% of us said that we had. In 45% of the cases, people said that nobody reached out to them to provide support after this event. And only about a quarter of surgeons were satisfied with their institution's response to the event. When we asked, theoretically, if you were to experience an event, who would you like to be contacted by? This was really interesting and something to remember in terms of thinking about program building. 78% of them said they would want partners in their group to contact them. And 52% said other physician colleagues. This was a check all that apply question. 40% said they would be interested in institution-based peer support, and only 27% APSA-based peer support. And I think the most striking thing about this question is only 10% of us said that they wouldn't want to be contacted by anyone. So we want help, we're just not getting it. Some of my slides are similar to Kurt's slides. And I think people have already said it. Number one, first and foremost, when you think about peer support, it's all about culture change and transforming. You know, you think about the traditional surgical M&M, which was a lot of shame and blame, and we've talked a lot about transitioning that to systems focus. And just the idea that we don't have to be invulnerable, that we are all prone to error, and that it's okay to talk about it, and we should be talking about it. Normalizing the reactions that are normal to have, a normal reaction to an abnormal event, as it has been said. Transitioning from isolation to community. and not thinking about self-care being selfish, but allowing you to perform better and to give more by taking care of yourself. So I think for me, when I first came into this concept of peer support, I hadn't had any training. I just sort of realized that there was a need for this and that people did this, and I really embraced it as part of my identity at my institution. So we are usually aware of big things that happen in the hospital, and I would, especially if I was involved with it or aware of it, I would just talk to people and say, you know, how are you doing? And have a conversation, whereas before I would have sort of shied away from it and assumed that nobody wanted to talk about it or that they're embarrassed or all the other misconceptions we have. This happened mostly with other surgeons, but also, you know, if I was in a difficult, you know, ECMO case with one of our intensivists, there were several situations where I would reach out to people across disciplines as well. And when I would have these conversations, I think the two most important things are to reaffirm your confidence in their skills and to acknowledge that this could have happened to anyone. And I think doing those things, it really, really helps. So when you think about this sort of grassroots efforts, if you don't have the buy-in of your leadership, if you don't have any kind of budget to work with, how do you do grassroots? So I think focusing on trainees, someone had mentioned before in the chat, on educators like program directors, on clinical leaders, division chiefs and chairs, and especially in the high acuity zones in the hospital, should really be the audience that you're thinking about. And basically, I would just take every opportunity to present on this topic every chance you get, whether it's part of a didactic curriculum for your trainees, program directors meetings, if there are areas in the hospital where leaders convene, grand rounds presentations, and also division meetings. So I've used all of these different venues. Basically, anyone who will listen, I will give a talk about second victim syndrome and peer support. And it just becomes part of the local vocabulary, and people have a language to talk about it. So I have some QR codes and links embedded in the slide deck, and I wanted to share a couple little examples of some of the slides that I've used that you could adapt to be used at your own institution. So this is some slides that we have a wellness retreat every spring for our fellows, so all the fellows in the Children's Hospital. It's about 40 or 50. And I gave this talk to them, basically talking about these were the goals of the hour. We used Poll Everywhere to collect some data, which came in really handy on the back end, and I'll tell you more about that. But basically to start, we just said, like, how familiar are any of you with this concept of second victim syndrome? Using these answer choices. And then this is a really important thing, I think, as you've seen tonight, being able to share a personal story, not necessarily the details of the story, but the fact that it happened to you and you're seen as some whatever role model in your local environment, and people just seeing you talk about your own experience makes them realize that it's okay to talk about it. So in this particular venue, it was for our fellowship, for all the fellows. So I talked about an experience I had had when I was a fellow, and all the reactions I had, as Matt did in the video with Kurt, and just spent about 90 seconds describing my own personal experience. And I think it really engages people and helps them remember this and realize that it's okay to talk about it. We asked them a series of questions after we had taught them about what second victim syndrome was, including had they ever experienced it, what would stop them from asking for help, how often have they been concerned that a colleague could be experiencing it, and what would stop them from reaching out to a colleague. And then this slide I stole from Kurt. I love this slide because this really just spoke to me the first time I saw him present it. So I include this slide in every presentation I make around the hospital because I think it's so true. When you think, oh, they want some time, I'm going to give them some space, and they just feel isolated and alone. We think, oh, we should lessen their caseload, and they think nobody has confidence in me anymore. They're taking my cases away. We don't know what to say. They just wish you could treat them normally. We don't want to make her relive the situation. I'm constantly reliving the situation all the time, whether or not people are talking to me about it. So I think this series of misconceptions and the actual answers are really helpful to reframe the conversation. We had breakout sessions at the end of this lecture, and we had them get together in small groups and talk about how hearing my experience resonated with them and to share their own experiences with each other. And then we asked them to make a large group report out about what are the local barriers here at our hospital to having them get help. And we then took this after we gathered feedback from the fellows around the institution. And I think it was really, really helpful in terms of getting program directors engaged, in terms of getting chairs and chiefs of divisions engaged, and then finally our C-suite, just having our own data to share. This was not an intentional, planned out thought process, but it just ended up working out that way, and it was very compelling. Some people are not going to recognize that this is important or just not want to listen to it, and if you can actually tell them this is what our own trainees are saying, it was very impactful. And I have another link to a slide deck of how we shared our data, and these are some results from our polls. So most of the fellows, before we talked to them, had never heard of it, 59%. And then once we taught them about it, 56% said they had actually experienced it. And the things that would stop them from asking for help, other things we've sort of talked about. Interestingly, there were a lot of comments about, like, I don't think my program director knows what this is, so I'm not going to go ask them for help. So that was a real alarm bell that went off and led to a lot of education for program directors. And then when we asked them how concerned they were that a colleague could be experiencing second victim syndrome, almost 20% of them said not just once, but 3 or more times they've been concerned. So this appears to be really common among trainees, and that's what other literature would suggest as well. And then we asked about what would stop them from reaching out to a colleague. Similar answers as to what's known, just feeling awkward, not really knowing what to say, not wanting to make assumptions. So this data was really used as a call to action for us to educate the program directors and other faculty, and then eventually to build infrastructure to support our trainees. So this brings me to the moving on from grassroots and how to think about building a program. So the first step is really to figure out what already exists at your institution. So my interesting experience with that was when I was getting ready to present at the Fellows Wellness Day, I realized we actually had a peer support at nemours.org email address, and I hadn't known that this existed, and I sent a test email before I shared this resource with them, and nobody responded. So that was a big wake-up call, and that also gave me some good ammunition, maybe that's not the right word, but to take to the leadership to say, like, clearly there's interest, we have this, it's kind of an empty shell of a program, and how do we build this? Thinking about where a program should sit in terms of the architecture of your institution. There's a lot of different parts of the institution that this touches, whether, there's the employee program, there's risk management, there's patient safety, there's HR. I think the ideal place for this to sit, although not all organizations have one, is if you have a chief wellness officer with a budget underneath them, this is where that belongs. We recently, I'm really excited to say, hired a chief wellness officer and sit in her, under her authority, but initially it was in HR for a while, but that's problematic because you don't want it to feel punitive at all, like HR is calling me to give me peer support. So that's a really important thing to think about just in terms of how your institution is structured. And then allies, I'm going to let Jennifer talk a little bit about psychology as an ally. Patient safety is another ally. Gathering data, just like we did, I can't tell you how impactful that was and how easy it was to do. And then eventually making the case to leadership. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these last few bullet points, but I wanted to turn it over to Jennifer. I don't know if you're muted or if you're able to unmute yourself to talk a little bit about the interplay with psychology.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for letting me join you. Lauren had asked me to talk a little bit just about our relationship and how, we are children's hospitals, so I think she was at first wondering with the child psychologist, how could we play a role and what would be our role, and we kind of met just through the fellow retreat, and our part of it was that we were integrating some of the psychology fellows in, and we just, I think it evolved a little bit just through talking about this and how could we address some of the needs of the fellows. And my strategy a lot as I've been at the hospital and seeing different initiatives kind of die on not take off versus really trying to get attention to some things with with what seems to be deaf ears is to try to find as many allies as possible, and also allies that have the different pieces of the puzzle and may have different perspectives. And some of our first talks with Lauren was, we talked about the different approaches and going more data driven and talking about the actual facts of the error versus, being the psychologist, encouraging her to talk about emotions and the impact. And I think how we've been nice allies is that I think we had different connections across the hospital, and we had different audiences there. And I think, for the psychology team, obviously, hopefully we have a good background in emotional health and wellness, and that is something that we focus on, and that's something that we're viewed as experts on. And so to be able to have that voice to it, that how having this peer support is critical to wellness and to emotional health, from a team that has the expertise in that, I think gives some credibility to it. I think also with psychologists, even though we're the pediatric psychologists in our medical teams, we're integrated into a number of the different medical services across the hospital, and I think we often informally already serve as the role of a peer supporter with teams when, not necessarily just with second victim, but just when teams have encountered hard events, and whether it's a death of a patient that was unavoidable. But we serve as these roles and really talk about burnout. And for us, trying to normalize, just talking about burnout and talking about stress comes a little bit more naturally to our group, I think. I think we also just being able to put words to some of the things of understanding the dynamics of high achievers, and just with the power of shame, and being able to put words to what that means and what those experiences are, and really normalize it a bit, makes it, I think, sometimes a safer place to have the conversations. And I mentioned, again, that we have a different perspective of the leadership dynamics. And I think sometimes we're on different committees, or we already might know what other silos, or what other initiatives are taking place, and can link them to other initiatives. I think as Lauren and I have gone through this, we've found, there's been a lot of grassroots efforts popping up in different places. And how do we, bring all those allies together to have a louder voice rather than, 5 or 6 different groups trying to work on it independently. So I think, the lessons we have learned is to really look for people with diverse backgrounds that have the different strengths and the different voices and the different audiences, and to see if by bringing those people together, you can have a more powerful impact, so that leadership that can make the decisions and that have the resources will hear. You can also tag team a little bit, because the senior leadership might not necessarily know that you got this relationship. So sometimes Lauren would go at it at one direction, and then I'd kind of follow up on a different one. And so they'd hear it from 2 different areas, from 2 different perspectives, and then it has a little bit more of a powerful message.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with all that. And I just wanted to share this with all of you, because it would never have occurred to me. I think of, pediatric psychology not as being a psychologist for adult surgeons and other doctors, but it really makes perfect sense. And obviously their life experience and their professional experience is extremely applicable here. So just something to think about. So what's been helpful to me in terms of engaging leaders, first of all, just knowing, I remember one early conversation I had, it probably with Jennifer, which was like, you can just go and you can request a meeting with the CMO. And I was like, really, I can? I've been here for 5 or 6 years at a fellowship, and am I allowed to just do that? And it's like, yes, you can. Anybody in the organization can do that. And going into that conversation with data, I think having our self-generated data was really helpful. We also have physician engagement surveys, and the results are widely known to everyone, and no one has, I think there are very few places with excellent physician engagement, and I think this is one of the things that is a driver of that, and so we were able to bring that into the conversation as well.
I think, and just real quickly, I think that was really key.
you know, every year hospitals have something that they're like, this is the buzzword for the year, whether it's wellness, whether it's engagement, whether it's patient satisfaction, retention. So any of that, where that you can see what is driving the organization and what is part of their vision and the overall strategic plan, you can tie this to almost any of those initiatives. And if you can tie it to what they've already set as a priority and show how this will help reach those goals, you got an audience.
I think also helpful in these conversations was the well-established data that physicians who are suffering from this are less productive and more likely to make more errors. And there's an article, I'm not going to go into the details here, about the business case for investing in physician well-being, and you can actually like plug numbers in and it will estimate the cost of burnout and turnover, and then you can generate kind of to justify a budget, which can be substantial for a really well-developed program in peer support. So what does a successful peer support program look like? There are some materials on the Google Drive that have more details on this, but there are definitely FTEs required. There are some programs that have a physician director, others that just have a program manager, or some combination of both, as well as admin support. There's a lot that these people have to do in terms of recruitment and training of the peer supporters, management of referrals, a lot of the questions you guys had been asking before about how to match people up properly. Interestingly, when we think about the referrals and tracking the data, it's important to track not necessarily the details of any of the encounters, but just who's asking for help. Is it nurses, is it physicians, is it respiratory therapists, and just to be able to continue to keep your pool of peer supporters able to manage the demand. Marketing, just to make people know that the program exists. We have found a really great partner in one of our local adult hospitals, Christiana Care. It's like the main hospital for the whole state of Delaware. And they have an incredibly advanced wellness infrastructure as well as a peer support program where they get about 400 referrals per year. And almost about 90% of them are not self-referrals. So the marketing is really important in embedding the process into many of the adverse event review processes that already happen in the hospital. Having meetings to help the peer supporters maintain their skills and their identities as a peer supporter is really helpful. And then I just also wanted to say a word about diversity. And when I'm talking about diversity, I mean diversity in terms of, you know, you want to have doctors, you want to have nurses, you want to have educators, you want to have respiratory therapists. It should be a very diverse group in terms of the roles they play in the institution. It also should be diverse in terms of gender and race and ethnicity. I think that the way that women and underrepresented minorities may experience adverse events is somewhat different, perhaps, than men. This is a really disturbing study that many of you may be familiar with. This used Medicare data to look at referral patterns from physicians to surgeons. And what they found was that if a female surgeon had a death of a patient, their referrals dropped by 34%. And there was not really any appreciable drop in referrals when the same thing would happen to a male surgeon. So when we're afraid that what Matt mentioned in the video about like how is a pediatrician going to look at me after this happened, maybe men don't have to worry about that so much, but women do. I couldn't find any similar data for minorities, but we know that populations in general that may be marginalized are going to struggle with potentially in different ways. And I think it's really important to, as you build your program, thinking about diversity. And then in terms of increasing utilization, as I mentioned, relying on self-referrals is going to fail. When we're suffering, we don't ask for help. So embedding the referrals into the adverse event review process and encouraging people to refer their colleagues, encouraging leaders to refer people in their division after an event happens. We worked with risk management as well, because often when something really bad happens, they're one of the first people to get a call, and they are responsible for a lot of the referrals as well. I wanted to spend a couple of slides on this question about you know, non-self referrals. So this is also from the survey. We had some open-ended questions about, you know, how would you feel about being contacted? And this person expressed some trepidation that I think many people would feel. The wording being contacted by would imply initiation from outside as a result of some alerting system. That sounds intrusive. But there were several people who had actually experienced this themselves and actually were very supportive of the idea. I appreciate they took the time to have someone reach out to make me feel less alone. This person said they were contacted in the afternoon and told that their next day was canceled. I met with a support person who guided me through the process of recovery, and I can't tell you how much I appreciated it. So I think going beyond a self-referral is absolutely essential, despite the fact that it might make some people uncomfortable. And I think that's part of the training for the peer supporters is how do you approach an encounter differently when it was someone who asked for help versus someone who sort of was automatically referred or referred by another person. In our institution, and probably many of you are familiar with Candor, it is a process that is supported by ARC, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And the whole concept of Candor is when it's an adverse event review process, and there's a whole toolkit on their website, and I know we use it at Nemours, and this was helpful for me to be able to speak this language with our leaders and our administrators, because the first thing on the Candor checklist for an adverse event review is considering additional care provider referrals to EAP and or peer support programs. So this happens automatically. When Kurt was talking before about enduring the Inquisition, we all know we've been through this. We go through our M&M, we go through our other adverse event reviews, other institutions or other departmental M&Ms. So part of reliving it, the trigger that leads to having to relive the trauma over and over should also trigger support. It seems like common sense, but it's just not the way things are in most hospitals. I think it's really critical. And then finally, I want to wrap this up because we're really running short on time. How do you maintain your identity as a peer supporter? There were questions before about how much you have to practice this before it gets comfortable, and you may not be doing that many referrals, especially at the beginning, but I think having regular training sessions for supporters that include refresher courses and practicing with simulated encounters. And then one of the things that Christiana does and that I'm hoping we will do at Nemours as well is having quarterly meetings to share our experiences, maintain skills, and just maintaining that part of your identity and just thinking about it every day when you go to work. It's not just when you get called on to do an actual formal encounter. It's just constantly being in that role and thinking about yourself in that role. I've done far, far more informal peer support encounters than formal ones. So here's a quick slide about accessing materials. There's a link here on the drive. If you have the slide, it's open on your computer, or you can take a picture or put your camera at the QR code and it will take you to the drive. And we have all our presentations that were used during this meeting. We have the presentations that I've used to kind of spread the word throughout my institution. We have a justification with a rationale and what are the FTEs required and what is the job description for the program manager, and lots of information that might be useful to all of you. So that's widely available through these links. And I just wanted to pause there and answer questions. I do want to do a time check. We've been hoping at the end of this to do some breakout sessions, but it is almost the end of the 2 hours and I want to respect everyone's time. So how about we do our questions and kind of final wrap-ups, and then if people want to stay on, we can split whoever wants to stay on into breakout rooms, but we won't reconvene afterwards because I don't want to make everybody have to stay. Kurt, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's, I guess both Lauren and I were surprised at the number and quality of the questions that came up during the discussion. Sometimes when we've done this in the past, if we ask if anyone has any questions, all you can hear is crickets. That's what happened at the AAP when we talked about it. So anyway, we wanted to wrap this up tonight by beginning the process of creating some legacy in the APSA organization. Those 3 questions are created, the first one predominantly for you to reflect yourself about what your next step is. The second one would be, how do you become influential in your institution? And then the third one is what does, now that you've learned what you've learned, if you learned anything tonight, what would be the best next step for APSA and for those who will lead this program. Do I have any takers for any of those three questions? Okay, Ben Nwame, I'm going to call you out, my friend. You're a program director, president of the group. What should APSA do next to develop this conversation and create more community about this?
Well, thanks, Lauren, for the excellent work that you've done. I hope that with all the support that the program directors give you in getting all the data from the fellows, that you will come back to our meeting to provide the data to the program directors so that we can, take this information to our trainees and to our faculty and then move the ball forward. I think that is going to be really important to take this back to our training programs and share this with the faculty across all the training programs. I think that would be a good way to start.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I had been thinking that I should do that Pull Everywhere lecture for all of our pediatric surgery fellows and push that out to all of the program directors because I just think it's really impactful to gather the data from the people that we're actually in charge of. So, no, I appreciate that, and we can talk about it. There was a comment from Marion, who is in practice with no other pediatric surgeons, to see an APSA-based peer support group would be helpful. And I think this would apply to many surgeons who are in a solo practice or a smaller group practice if they don't have someone in their local environment. So it's something we've talked about, and I think it should definitely be a goal we should work towards. Thank you, Marion.
So I'm not going to be shy. Dan Saltzman, Kathy Van Loen, what do you think we should do next in the APSA community? If there needs to be something, like Marion said, what does it look like? What's the next steps?
So this is Kathy. We can put this on the program for next year, and as many people might suspect, there will be a virtual component to the program next year, just because none of us will have any funds from our own institutions to even attend Phoenix if it is in person. So maybe it'll be partly in person, partly, partly virtual. But there's no question, Lauren, we can work with you on making this a discussion. Perhaps it should go to the Board of Governors to talk about whether or not there needs to be more of a rollout of a national, effort so that people can contact the national peer supporters. So that would be more of a Board of Governors thing. I think we've talked about this before, and Ron talked about it at last year's meeting. So just another presentation on it may not be the next step. I would think maybe going to the board and deciding, do they want to seek out some funds and create a program. I'm happy to help facilitate if I can. Casey's still in charge for another year, and then I get to help with the program after that.
I agree with Kathy. I think that's a step that we could do. Also, I'm anxious to read Lauren's slides to give us a prescription, if you will, to do this at our own institutions and see if we can ramp this up at our own shops, if you will. I'm sensitive to the fact that there's there's some practices without other pediatric surgeons. That's hard, and I love the idea of having APSA sort of be the home, if you will, the home base, and it can be done. I think it can be done.
Hey Dan, one comment about all of us have different environments that we work in. I'll just share a brief personal experience. Children's has competed for this Fortune 100 award as a corporation for 15 years or so, and they've won it many times. And one day, the COO of our hospital, who was a cardiologist, got in the elevator and and he was wearing one of these silly T-shirts, and I was, in my 7th month of having recovered from this thing, and I've known him for a long time, and the doors closed. It was just the two of us, and he got the whole ton of bricks. I just said, this is not a Fortune 100 company. If we don't provide any support for people who are struggling, how can you wear that T-shirt and so forth? And surprisingly, I had that conversation with a couple C-Wing people, and then I was really surprised to note that they reached out and began the conversation, and they put some resources behind this, and it seemed to come from human resources. And so while each institution is going to be different, perhaps that would be one place where you would want to begin this. Another place might be the chief academic officer, who can recognize or may know that some of the trends in the system and may be influential in helping get some resources. We have one director level person who runs this, and then one program person that does the legwork and makes things happen. So that's how it has worked in our institution.
We started in our institution very small, so we started in the Department of Surgery, and it's just internal to the department. And then as my colleague and I started talking about it at faculty development programs, OB-GYN and anesthesia wanted to join, and so it's kind of becoming organic just from people hearing about what we started, and hopefully now we'll be able to reach out to HR or somewhere else to get some funding for it, because it's all being done internal right now on a volunteer basis.
Can I underscore one of the things that Lauren brought up about, yes, you can go to a CMO. I think that if the more these programs can, they don't even have to be standardized, but they're just as a willingness, you can become a CMO's best friend. What is a CMO responsible for? Yes, they are responsible usually for the risk portfolio, but by the same token, without, as I said, the two sides of this, everything's going to fail. And you go back to all the recurrent error and the impact on quality. But if you have any intention of starting this, even at an organic level, let the CMO know, because they could use all the help they can get.
Thanks, Tom. So there's a lot of energy, it sounds, verbally and on the chat about an idea of an APSA-based program, and just starting out even really informally, even just with the members who are on this call. And we have talked about this sort of informally a lot. I think one of the concerns I had, I don't know if anybody else would share this concern, is it's one thing if someone's asking for help and they go to an APSA-based group, but it would be another if someone experiences something in their own local environment and they might be embarrassed and not want other APSA members to know about it, especially if it's sort of a more senior or well-known APSA member who happens to be in this group. So I think we do.
Can I just say, so, I think when we're talking about people that are suffering, which is what we're talking about, we have to have a mechanism. And I know that I could list at least 10 people on this call that would call any pediatric surgeon in the country and feel safe doing it and not have them feel awkward. So it may be that, the just out of practice can't give me a call, but I promise you that if word got to this group that there was somebody in trouble and Dave Wesson called them with the same kind of intro that we've been talking about, the very gentle, we've all been there, this is not anything, how can I help? I just think people would do it. So I would say that in not reaching out has a higher consequence, particularly right now with all the stress people are under, than risking embarrassing them. And particularly if we send out a blast that says this is in place and is available, and then if people get a call, they won't be surprised.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So I'm just trying, it's now right around 7 o'clock. Just sort of as an action item, we have recorded this. So if anyone knows anyone who wasn't able to enroll or wasn't available at this time, we'll make sure the recording becomes available. And then I would love to have volunteers. I'm not sure if everybody on this call would necessarily feel comfortable joining our APSA peer support group, but I would argue that you should. I think we, just by being here, you know, I think we clearly are committed to this and we care about it, and probably have already informally engaged in a lot of these encounters without realizing it's what we were doing. So I'd like to sort of start to build a list of volunteers that we could put, and Terry had suggested on the chat, like a group email. So if somebody asks for help, we don't have to worry about having like a call schedule or something like that. And just start really basic, just have a group of names and maybe an email address, and advertise it so people know that it exists. And even just by word of mouth, starting with this group, I think we can make it happen. Any other thoughts or last questions?
Lauren, maybe we should give Mary the chance to kind of close things up, since she's been the task force leader for the last couple of years. Mary, we didn't, we're not trying to surprise you with anything, but you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. If you'd like to kind of give us the benediction, then that might be a great way to wrap this up.
I don't know about a benediction, except I know everyone on this call is also under a lot of stress. So I do think we can be a mutual support group for each other and model this for each other, which is perhaps a way to get us all connected. And then that, I think, will organically grow. So I'm very proud of what Kurt and Lauren and everyone's done with this, and I know the whole APSA community is, and I just really want to thank you guys. This has been incredible. You've done a wonderful job with this. And it's really just about caring, and then figuring out a way to operationalize that across time and distance and with technology like this in a way that makes sense. So that is a gauntlet that's been thrown tonight, and I think we can meet it. Thanks, Mary.
Leanne, this video will be available to people to watch again. Is that correct? Or how would we access it on the APSA website? We just go to the annual meeting and look for a July 14th offering, or how would we do that?
Well, Leanne, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Give us a couple of days to download, do a wee bit of editing on it, and then we'll send you a link. That's okay. where we place it. We'll include it in everybody who's on this call. Where do you want folks who volunteer? I see some volunteers in the chat, but who do you want people to be in touch with if they're interested?
Can I just propose that we have just knighted everyone here as a volunteer, and we'll have an opt-out? Because, I mean, I think at least for the training, and you may or may not get called, but let's just do it that way to start with. Because people are here because they care, and let's run with that. And we'll just, different people have different time constraints and different things, and may choose to not respond to specific calls, but let's just include everyone.
That seems great, Mary. I'm getting like flooded with private and group messages that everybody wants to do it. I think almost everyone on the call has probably messaged me. If you, for some reason, don't want to, maybe just send me an email, or just send Leanne an email and we can take you off. That would be fine. But no, I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you guys so much. It's already past 7. If anybody wants to stay on, we can do a breakout rooms. That was we thought we'd have more time, but we appreciate all the participation just to do a practice session. One of the things on the Google Drive is a script. It might have been the one that Kurt used to make the video, because I got it from him, that you could use to practice. It's on the Google Drive. So you can link to it right through my slides, which I'll be sure to send out to you if you didn't happen to just catch the QR code. And then if you don't want to do it right now, you can find some time to do it with a partner at your institution, or with anyone who's in the meeting right now. So If you want to stay on, stay on. Otherwise, feel free to sign off. And thank you guys so much for joining tonight. I'm really excited about this.
So yeah, I'm going to sign off, but I'm going to leave with the words of Bonnie Henry, who's my new hero. She's the, I forget her title, the public health person in British Columbia, who's the one that has said, be kind, stay calm, and be safe. Bye, guys.